these ideas that come from the stakeholders, they need to be turned into stories. Okay. So this is our stakeholders right there. All right. So stakeholders have ideas. Now, let's talk about this square down here on the lower right. Oops. So this I'm also going to draw as a factory as well. And this down here is the build team, because somebody's going to need to build something. Somebody's going to need to build something, whether it be for software development or for infrastructure. Doesn't really matter. Somebody's going to need to configure something, build something. There's some activity that needs to be done. So I'm going to put some individuals. In this team. And by now you know that when we build this team, that there are three things that are important about this team. And they're listed up here. Oops, sorry. Let's put it on top. They're co-located, cross-functional, and self-organizing. Okay, so what do we mean by co-located? Or I'm sorry, what do we mean by cross-functional? So if this were software development, I always say that we have developers, we have analysts, and we have testers all on the same team. But if it's infrastructure, this would be things like specialists in server installs. If we're thinking about our storage array, maybe there's specialists in server installs, maybe somebody from the networking team, maybe representatives from the network operations center. But the point is that we need to have everybody resident on this team in order to deliver on our commitment for this sprint. All right, so that's our team. Now the team has a constraint, like all factories that have constraints, and it can only do so many stories per week, maybe 4 to 6 stories per week, okay? And of course the stakeholders are going to have lots of ideas more than that, and they're going to keep coming up, all of these ideas, they're going to stack up. All right, so as these ideas stack up, they're going to be in kind of a warehouse type location. And we're going to introduce now our first very important role. And this individual is called the product owner. And the product owner is critical to understanding which of these ideas or needs are the most important and which should go first. Now, you've probably heard already this idea that in Agile, Scrum, we like to say that we can do, we've seen big gains, and some people talk about doing twice the work in half the time. And one of the ways that happens is studies have shown that in this backlog, and by the way, we call this the product backlog when all these ideas stack up in front of the product owner, that the actual needs that the stakeholders have, 70% of the value is in 30% of the backlog items, the product backlog items. So the product owner's job is to do everything they can do to find that 30% and deliver them early. Because when we deliver early and we show things to the stakeholders, oftentimes they will say, boy, I guess I didn't really need those things that I thought I needed. So often, particularly in software, we build a lot of things that the customer doesn't, that the stakeholders don't need. And so that's what this is all about, is finding those high value ideas or needs and deliver those first. And the product owner, maybe you've heard, one of the tools that they have in their toolkit is, I like to say, they have the responsibility and the authority to say no. Now, what do we mean when we say the product owner has the authority to say no? So as these ideas come barreling down from the stakeholders, the product owner will review these ideas and make a determination whether they should go into the backlog or not. Okay? So let me just put my label. This area over here is the product backlog. So they'll make a determination whether this idea goes into the product backlog or not. So they'll make a decision, they'll make a decision yes or no. Yes or no. If it's no, then the idea will get tossed into the garbage. It will go nowhere. If it gets yes, then it'll get into our warehouse of ideas that will sometime be part of the delivery for the stakeholders. And so that's the decision that the product owner makes, is which of these ideas should get loaded up first. Now, we've got another factory down here. And this factory is all about how do we take these ideas and turn these into stories. Okay? So we used to call these individuals story authors, but we don't anymore, simply because we recognize that anybody can write a story. Anybody and everybody should be able to write a story. They could be a tester, they could be a stakeholder. It doesn't matter. But the point is, somebody has this role that will take these ideas that are identified as a high priority, and they will turn these into stories, well-written stories that are small enough to be completed in one sprint. Because some of these ideas are big ideas. They're too big to complete in one sprint. So a lot of the work that we do on the left side of this diagram is all about splitting, sizing, sorting, sequencing, making sure they're small enough and the high priority ones go first. So what comes out of this factory here is well-written stories that have a few things about them. They have acceptance criteria, a definition of done. So we know a few things about them. All right, so let's keep going. All right, so once those stories are complete and they're coming out of this factory, we have, I like to put a stop sign right here. I like to put a stop sign here. And what this is this is our first very important event. And I'll just mention this. This is called the sprint planning meeting. That's event number one. It's called the sprint planning meeting, our first step. The sprint planning meeting is owned by the product owner. Now, okay, so this module is about roles, so let's focus on not so much on the event, but the role. The product owner, they own the sprint planning session, and there's two outcomes that are important in the sprint planning session, as is important to the product owner. And the first one is that they set a sprint goal. We want to have a sprint goal, and by now you've probably heard the term sprint. At 3M, generally these are 2 weeks. It doesn't have to be. It can be 1 week, could be more. Generally, they're 2 weeks long, and it is an iteration of the build team to deliver some value to the stakeholders. Okay. So when we first start this up, the question is, well, what do we put in this sprint? And this is an output of the sprint planning meeting is the decision as to what we're going to put in this sprint. So the product owner has two goals in the first part of that meeting. And the first is to define the sprint goal for this meeting. For this sprint. The sprint goal for the sprint. Every sprint has a sprint goal. And also make the determination of which of these that are piled up in the backlog will get loaded onto this truck and delivered to the build team for this very next sprint. Okay? Now this cargo that is on this truck here has a name. Okay? So let me quickly identify that. This cargo in this truck is called the sprint backlog. And that is the items that the product owner, as a part of the sprint planning meeting, has determined should be pulled from the product backlog, loaded onto this truck, and delivered to the build team for inclusion in the next sprint. So that is our commitment. By the time we end the sprint planning meeting, the entire team has committed to deliver on these stories in the next sprint. And of course, the build team has input in that, and we'll get into those details a lot more when we talk about sprint planning. All right, so the build team, they start sprinting, okay? And when they sprint, every single day they have another event called the daily stand-up. And this is where, we'll talk more about that later on. This is where they have a meeting to quickly I'll tell you, it's a meeting to talk about what they did yesterday, what they're going to do today, and do they have any impediments, okay? So let's introduce our second very important role. And this person, you've probably heard of them by now, is called the Scrum Master. That's a Scrum Master. Okay? So the Scrum Master listens to the daily stand-up meeting very carefully, and they're honed in to hear if there are any impediments, because they want to know. The Scrum Master, I like to say, the Scrum Master is inwardly focused to the team, wants to make sure that the team has smooth flow of work through the team. Smooth flow of work, no impediments. The Scrum Master has a lot of lean thinking. They want to eliminate waste. They want to keep things moving smoothly. The Scrum Master is also the defender of the Agile Scrum methods, of the framework. They're defender of the framework and the defender of the team. Okay? I like to say they're inwardly focused relative to the team. Product owner, on the other hand, is outwardly focused with a keen eye to the business, a partner with the stakeholders, understanding the needs and ideas that are coming down, that are going into the product backlog, and lobbying for ideas, high-value ideas, that are going to load into the sprint backlog and get delivered to the development team for delivery in the next sprint. All right. So now, this factory, the build team factory, has outputs. Okay, like any factory, there are things that output from the build team, and what we call this output, we call it the minimally viable product, or some people call this minimally viable product, or an increment is another name, and there's another name that just slipped my mind. Potentially shippable product. Okay. Now, last time we taught this, people kind of got hung up on the language potentially shippable product, but basically it means that it's some output, some iteration that has value. Okay? That's why they call it potentially shippable. It's not to say they would ship it, but it could be. It's something, maybe it's a form, and it's not the entire application, but maybe it's one form that's a search screen that has test data, it's connected to the database, has the middleware, has the form. Everything's there so that it physically does work and can be demonstrated. Okay? So which is our next point here is that we've got these outputs will potentially get loaded onto this truck and delivered to the stakeholders. I say potentially because we have another stop sign right here. That's kind of an ugly stop sign. One more stop sign. Okay, so this stop sign here is another event, and this one is called the sprint review. Okay, and the sprint review is an event that is run by the product owner. And once again, the product owner will make a decision, yes or no. And if they decide yes, the cargo will get loaded and delivered to the stakeholders. If they decide no, and again, this happens during the sprint review meeting, then most likely it'll go back over here into the product backlog and get amended. Or oftentimes what happens is new stories get created because the stakeholders, through the product owner, they will say, yeah, this looks good, we like it, but there's a few more things we need, some things we thought of. This is all about the feedback that is so important to Scrum Agile. We love the short feedback loop, it's very important to us. So once those are loaded onto this truck and delivered to the stakeholders, then we've seen one complete iteration of an idea all the way through to delivery to the stakeholders. So let's just quickly wrap up a couple of ideas about the important roles. Scrum Master we mentioned. The Scrum Master is a servant leader, okay? They are not a manager. That is very important with the methodology because we call this team down here, up on top I put this co-located, self-organizing, cross-functional. So it's a self-organizing team. That means it does not have anybody who is lording over this team, giving them direction, telling them what to do. That doesn't happen. The Scrum Master is not a manager. They are a servant leader. And oftentimes their role will evolve over time. It will start out as a teacher often. And that happens because many times when a new team is spun up, usually the Scrum Master is the one that has most of the Scrum Agile training and is able to be the defender of the framework and teach the team, help the team. And then they evolve into a coach and sometimes a consultant. So their role changes over time, but always they are there to meet the needs of the team, to be a servant leader. And then the product owner, they are, again, I like to say they're outwardly focused. They're all about the product vision. They're about guiding the team in order to make this vision a reality, turning these ideas and these needs into something tangible. All right, so to kind of wrap up the discussion, At the heart of all of this is a short feedback loop. Extremely important to the Agile Scrum framework. We're all about the feedback because we don't want to be working on things that don't matter. You know, we've done that for a lot of years, and we discovered that there's a better way to work. So we want to demonstrate as quickly as we can something to the stakeholders, make sure we're on the right path. I mean, one of the ways I like to think about it is that every time we do a sprint review meeting, we're getting recalibrated to the critical path. We're getting our sights focused, recalibrated, so that we make sure that at the end of the day, at the end of the project, that we've hit something that is valuable to the stakeholders, that we've hit that point where they are delighted. All right. This might be a good time to take any questions you might have.
Are stories considered tasks or work?
So we'll talk about this more as we go through the week, but there is a hierarchy, and the top of it, as far as we're concerned, is the epic. The epic is a big piece of work, like maybe it's creating a new storage array. And then from that, we would break that into stories, and stories are the thing that is the iteration that we would deliver, okay? Like, do the cabling for the storage array, okay? And then underneath the story is subtasks, and that would be literal tasks that need to be, that are assigned to somebody and have an hours estimate that they log time against. Those are the tasks. Like, let me flip to software development because I'm most familiar with that. But if a story was to create a small screen, let's just say a very small screen with a couple of fields, and connected to the database just so that we can enter a little bit of information and do a search on the database and see what it returns, okay? The tasks, the story would be that search form. The task would be somebody's assigned to do functional analysis. Somebody's assigned to actually do the building of it. Somebody's assigned to test it. Those are tasks assigned to somebody that have hours. Does that help?
It does.
Very good.
Hi, Craig, this is Sue. Could you have stories that are, or what would happen if you had stories that are dependent on each other? So, for example, I think I have two pieces of work to do. One is to build an interface, and one is to analyze some requirements on something, whatever, that will feed into that interface. They're kind of two distinct pieces of work, but there's a dependency there.
Yeah, that's a good question. And we do see dependencies, and we do have the need to manage them as we go through the process. Some of the dependencies cross teams, and that's where we have meetings where the tier meetings or whatever, where we're able to communicate those things. And then we have some that are stories that have dependencies, and within them we can link. We have some ability to connect stories to identify that dependency.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
Just one from me, Sarah. Would you ever have a situation where people would have dual roles? So product owner would be also be a Scrum Master or a team member, or is that bad?
Okay, so that's a good question, Sarah. That's a very good question. And so we like to talk about the white robes of Scrum. And what I mean is those people who defend Scrum and who are fundamentalists about the way Scrum works. They would say, no, you don't have that. These individual roles are important because they have distinct differences in the motivation of the individuals. They actually kind of, in a way, they kind of have some healthy tension. So it's necessary for them to be individuals that have their own motivations and their own agenda, so to speak. But, you know, there are situations when we're first starting out, you know, we've had some of that happen. It is not the best, but I would not say that it's impossible to do that, or that you've failed if you've done that when you're setting up your teams. But we do strive to get to the point at some point where we have an individual Scrum Master, product owner that are not actually part of the team itself. Does that help?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, this is Mark. I was just wondering who would attend each of the events. Presumably in the sprint planning, the daily stand-up, and the sprint review, you'd have representation from each of the roles.
Yeah, another very good question, and we'll cover that in great depth when we get into. we have entire sessions on each one of those. But just to quickly answer your question, the sprint planning is owned by the product owner. Scrum Master goes, the team goes. Sprint planning is all about making a commitment for the sprint. So certainly we want the team there. The team it actually has two parts. I didn't get into this because we'll talk about this more in a day. It actually has two parts, the what and the how. So the product owner is all about the what, and this is what I diagrammed here, pulling these ideas and deciding, loading them into the sprint backlog, what is it that we're going to do. But there's also the how part, and this is where the build team participates in that meeting and saying, you know, we have a limit. We're like a factory. We're a build factory, and that has constraints. We can only do so much. So they will say stop at some point at which we cannot take on any more stories, because we want them committed to this sprint in a way that they believe that they can achieve this. Okay? So certainly they go to it. The daily stand-up is all about the team. Certainly everybody who's participating in the team goes to the daily stand-up, and each day they give a quick status of what they did yesterday, what they're going to do today, and do they have any impediments. Certainly the Scrum Master is there. Scrum Master kind of leads that meeting, although it's okay for the build team, the team to actually take leadership themselves. Scrum Master is listening for those impediments. Product owner can go, but generally they're there only as kind of ears only, listening only, if they wish to go. Sprint review is an interesting discussion as to who goes to that. Certainly that is owned by the product owner, but we like to have, I have 3 teams right now in my area. I work in Polaris and MTD QM. And so in that area, there's 3 teams, and we have very large sprint reviews. We just had one this morning, in fact, because a sprint it's ending tomorrow morning at 7. So we had one this morning at 9:15, and I think we had about 30 people there, but generally we have representation from healthcare, from automotive, from all the businesses. They want to see what's going on. They get a chance to see what we're doing and a chance to comment on it. They love this. I've had such good feedback from the businesses that, you know, every other week they get to sit in and see what's coming up in Polaris, what's happening in MTD QM, what are they building, what are they working on, and we want their feedback because that's how we shape the product. We can't do this without their feedback. We'll get it wrong if we try. Does that help?
Yep, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. All right, Dee, I think it's time to transition to the slides. And so I will stop presenting.